Welcome to The Long Take Review, a film podcast with one eye always on the Oscar race. I'm your host, Jen Bankard, and I'm here with a man of science. Explorer blood's in him. It's PT McNiff. How's it going, PT?
I have taken 5 milligrams of heroin through the toes for pain, amphetamines for energy, and cocaine because I'm partial to cocaine. I'm doing well, Jen. How are you?
That was on my short list of quotes that you might pick. So
great.
I'm glad I was right.
Compare the full list later.
Okay. So those were references to the film we are here to review today, Yorgos Lanthimos' Poor Things, which follows the growth and development of Bella Baxter, a woman subjected to the experiments of mad scientist turned adoptive father, Godwin Baxter. The quote PT just cited is from that character. It's a dark comedy, quite dark in places, that is as much about patriarchal control over the female body as it is about the exaltations and harsh realities of being alive. So we're talking about Poor Things now after the Oscars. I almost said posthumously, but it's not dead. The film is very much still alive.
The Oscar race has passed.
Right. Yes. So it is the only Best Picture nominee that we did not manage to do a full review of. And it just became available to stream on Hulu. So we thought, that it still made sense, even after the Oscars, to do a full review of Poor Things. And obviously our omission of it, which was not intentional, I should just say, it just, we never kind of got it together and never got around to it. But that was a pretty egregious error, I would say, because the film won, if you don't remember, 4 Academy Awards total in production design, makeup and hairstyling, costume, and of course, one of the biggest surprises of the night, Emma Stone for Best Actress. So we're not going to have a separate Oscars watch at the end because our watch has ended for the season. But we are going to kind of probably sprinkle just some, references to the performance of this film at the Oscars sort of throughout. It might, I'm just going to guess it's going to come up periodically. So we're just assuming that's going to happen naturally and not have a designated section for it at the end.
Yeah. And I think the thing to emphasize here is that it isn't because we were loath to cover it. I think we wanted to talk about it. Part of it was the rollout of when people could see it, because I feel like it was always 2 or 3 weeks in between any two of us amongst the Long Take Review crew watching it. So it was never fresh in everyone's mind. Plus, other movies came out, and it was always on the schedule of, or we do Poor Things. And now we've ended up here talking about it later. But glad to discuss it.
Yeah, I'm glad. I was actually kind of sad when I thought we were never going to do a review of it. So I'm glad we're playing a little bit of catch up now. So if you are listening to us for the first time, we have a spoiler-free section designed for those who have not seen the film, perhaps even a way to decide whether or not you want to check out this film. And then we will issue a very clear spoiler alert, and then we'll shift into spoiler mode for the rest of the show. But PT, if listeners wish to adventure with us more after listening to this episode, what can they do?
When you finish punching that baby, if you want to listen to new episodes when they drop, you can follow the Long Take Review wherever you get your podcasts. We host the feed on Jen's Substack, thelongtake.substack.com. But you can also find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, YouTube, anywhere where you get your podcasts. You can subscribe there. And you can also follow us on Instagram and Threads at The Long Take Review or on Letterboxd. The account is LTR Pod.
Thanks, PT. So we're just about ready to get into our discussion of Poor Things. But first, we want to do a quick movie news update.
Just in off the wire, it's your Hollywood news.
Aw, Greg was originally supposed to be here, but he couldn't make it.
Yeah.
That made me sadder. That reminded me. Okay, so I mostly wanted to do this one because we just haven't had one in a long time because of the award season was so busy and sort of naturally news-like. But the thing that really pushed me into doing movie news this week is that there's news specifically about Yorgos Lanthimos. PT, did you hear about this news before I dropped it into our Google Doc?
I did. Well, I didn't realize how soon it was coming out. I knew that it was planning to come out this year, but I didn't know it was so imminent.
Yeah, basically, I want to say like it hadn't been like even a day probably, and just like stills of the title of the film, which is kind of kindness or kinds of kindness plural. I might have typed that incorrectly.
It's kinds of kindness.
Okay, it is plural. I just
Plural,
forgot this. But the title of the film, Yorgos Lanthimos, and then it listed the cast, which has a lot of, the typical players from a lot of his films, including Emma Stone, and that it's coming out June 21st, 2024. So this is the part that really shocked me, because I was like, wait, that's very soon. Like, it's not even next year. So obviously they were working on this film even before Poor Things was doing its Oscar campaign, probably, right? Like,
yeah. Well, I remember hearing that that Emma Stone and Yorgos Lanthimos were doing a short film together. Now, I don't know if that means that a segment of this movie is going to be what I had heard about was the short film they were working on, or if there's also a short film. But I think that there was a little bit of a gap between Poor Things finishing and then being released because COVID and trying to figure out production stuff. So I guess they had a chance to jump in and do at least one more project, potentially two. It's intense, but that's great. I'm excited. I'm excited for more Yorgos, more Emma, and
I think Willem
this
Dafoe is the
idea.
other Poor Things person in it.
Mm-hmm. And Margaret Qualley. I don't know if you already said that, but Margaret
No, I didn't.
Qualley, who was
That's right.
also a small role in Poor Things, but she's back.
I actually always forget that that's her.
Yeah, when it cuts to her, it's like, oh,
right, you're here.
But yeah, apparently shot in New Orleans in late 2022, according to this Variety article. So they shot it a little while ago, because I think Poor Things was shot late 2021, early 2022. So like it was a little while, because I remember when we did our movie hype draft last spring, it was like, there's this movie that's basically done, but no one knew when it was coming out, called Poor Things. So yeah, it kind of gave them a chance to have another one locked and loaded, which, as we keep talking about on the show, there's the concern that there won't be a lot of content this year. So here's another thing to get us through the summer.
It's exciting. So what's weird about this is that the premise, as advertised, doesn't actually really sound like a typical Yorgos Lanthimos film. So it's a contemporary film, so not like weird period, like a lot of his other films have been, or I feel like period / futuristic, right? Like if you think about The Lobster. And it says it's set in the U.S. again, like typically associate Yorgos Lanthimos with Europe. And it's 3 different stories with 4 or 5 actors who play one part in each story. So like, what is this, a Wes Anderson movie? Like, I don't understand like what's going on.
It does seem like it. It's very, very strange. The other short film that Emma Stone did with Yorgos Lanthimos was called Bleat, and is out there, is apparently on Mubi right now. So this is, they've worked together a bunch. But yeah, this does feel very Wes Anderson. It feels very got a house company, which it has felt for a little while. Like Yorgos has been building up a cast of actors, or a little traveling troupe that goes with him from project to project, and they're here, and they're all going to do different parts. That sounds like something that we would all like, and it does sound very similar to the Wes Anderson, Henry Sugar and company, Roald Dahl short films, which Netflix has now put together into one like an hour and 45-minute feature film, if you want to look at it that way instead. And yeah, it seems like it should be interesting. I'm already looking forward to people being confused when they don't realize that these people are playing different characters from segment to segment. But maybe they have to be told it's like Cloud Atlas, which I'm sure is a reference everyone will get, because that was a very successful movie that people liked.
Right. Did you watch the new cut of Netflix Wes Anderson?
I just saw that it was there. I don't know if there's any changes.
how it plays. Yeah. Like that's what I would wonder, is if they literally just spliced them all into one thing, or if they added little transitions, or you know what I mean, like if there's something else that is trying to make it more connected. We'll have to have Greg tell us because I'm sure he'll watch it at some point.
Well, I expect I'll want to watch those again, and when I do, I'll watch that version. But yeah, I probably won't be imminently. So yeah, anyone out there
It's
who
just so
watches
funny that like the second they don't have to call it a short film, they were like, nope, it's all together.
It's like they waited for the Oscar to finish getting engraved, and then they were like,
Yeah,
perfect.
and they're like, great, we're good.
New Wes Anderson feature film here on Netflix. Enjoy it.
All right. Do you have any other news, PT?
The only other thing that sort of comes to mind, which is not anything that I saw, but there were initial reactions to the Alex Garland movie Civil War, which were pretty positive, which it feels like a very strange idea for a movie to put out this year. And, I get that is sort of the point of like, oh, this would be very uncomfortable. Like that's something to turn into and really try to explore. There were some question marks that people had around the sort of narrative of it, but and part of when there's a premiere, I think it was at South by Southwest, right, is where they did it. That sometimes the festival audiences are like super excited and they're happy they're there, and those are the reactions that come out first. But a lot of sort of this is a propulsive movie that really was entertaining or engaging. Again, maybe entertaining is the wrong word, but very engaging. So I still don't really want to see it, but it's good to hear that people are at least initially liking it. Though again, there's some folks who saw it started sort of poking at some of the ideas and concepts around it, but whatever. That was the big thing. Is I think it seemed possible that like his last movie Men, it could come out and people were like, nope, we don't like that. But apparently a lot of people said, yep, we do like it. So that's there. Yeah. That's on the radar.
There was actually a lot of buzz for stuff coming out of South by Southwest, which is kind of crazy because I feel like I heard a lot of critics complaining that the ones that had to go to South by Southwest because they were like, why is the Oscars overlapping with this film festival? Like I had to like take time out of this festival to go watch the Oscars. But I think Monkey Man got huge praise. That's probably right. Is the strongest film coming out of South by Southwest. So that's the Dev Patel. I mean, we shouldn't just call it like Dev Patel does John Wick, but that's basically the easiest way to describe it at this point.
That's the log line for sure.
Yeah.
They've set it up to look like that.
But actually, Hasib, our loyal listener, reported that he knew someone in the audience and can confirm that it's incredible. So I'm excited for that one. And then Fall Guy, right? That's the Emily Blunt, Ryan Gosling stunt.
Yes.
That's generally getting positive reviews. It's not like, I don't think it's going to reach like critical praise, but like it's one of those things where it was like it's good as an entertaining movie. Like that was the consensus. That we like it, but it's not necessarily like going to be like awards contender material.
Well, which makes sense because I mean it's based on like a cheesy 80s TV show. Yeah. That it's not, it's because the two of them recently were Oscar nominated and of course presented at the Oscars to promote it. Sometimes it's easy to think like, oh, maybe this is like Barbie. This will be more than we think, but it sounds like it's not, but is fun and could be a good time.
Yeah, apparently the stunts are really good, and that the whole thing is sort of like a love letter to the stunt community. So, the bit at the Oscars makes even more sense apparently to a lot of people now. So, yeah.
And
so
if
that
there
one,
were a stunt category, maybe they would get an Oscar nominated. Right? But alas,
it has to happen. It's just a matter of time, I think.
It is,
and it may be like many years, but I feel like it will happen. Especially once they broke through with casting. Like stunt has to be next, right? Like what would get in front of it? I don't know. But yeah, so yeah, lots of fun stuff. Can't wait to some of them coming out really soon. Like Monkey Man comes out like in a couple weeks, right? And then Fall Guys is this weekend, and like
don't forget Ghostbusters: Frozen Empire, of course, also comes out this weekend.
Sorry, yes, I did forget about that. You're really waving the Ghostbusters flag.
I mean, look,
in our group. I really appreciate that.
I really do like the, I grew up on Ghostbusters. I am of that generation of I was a kid when that came out. I really like it. I don't like what it morphed into in the culture wars appropriation of, fighting, being big mad about the Paul Feig reboot having women in it. And then we're going to give it back to the fans, which sounded like dudes need a Ghostbusters movie again, which, whatever. So I don't like all of that component to it, but I watch Ghostbusters all the time, and I watch Ghostbusters 2 on New Year's Day to start off the year, because it's a great New Year's movie. I recommend it, even though it's not a wonderful movie, but it's the big thing, the big ending is set on New Year's Eve.
Oh, that's a good point. I had forgot about that. Yeah. No, I'm a huge fan of the original Ghostbusters. I just haven't seen a single new one. So I just can't speak to the current franchise.
You don't need to.
I think Greg said that was the same true for him as well. But yeah,
Anyway.
So let's get into Poor Things, shall we?
Good. Yes, I like it.
So we'll start with the short take. PT, what was your general reaction to Poor Things? And then if you want to sprinkle in some context, what was your relationship to Yorgos Lanthimos' previous films before going into Poor Things?
That's a very good question that I should have prepared for more about. What is my history of that? Okay. So I had to double check what other movies of his I've seen. I really liked Poor Things. I think in our discussions amongst the 4 long take reviewers, I believe we'll see how things unfold in this episode. I was the strongest on this. I have had, I've done shuffling at the in the first few months of this year of what's my top on my list of 2023, but the top 4 are consistent, and Poor Things is one of those in the actual sort of end of year rankings. I had Poor Things at number 1. I thought it was my favorite movie. I had a great experience going to see it. It was whenever it was, early December. It was December 5th or so, the weekend it came out. It wasn't at a lot of theaters, but it was at one of the AMC's in Burbank, and the theater was packed, and people were just really locked in. Everyone was laughing at the jokes, and they were everyone was really on the vibe of it. In terms of Yorgos, I'm realizing, I do have gaps. I mean, I've seen The Lobster and The Favorite, and I love both of those movies. I missed Killing of a Sacred Deer, which I need to go back to. I haven't seen his earlier Dogtooth, Alps, and those earlier. I think they were all made in Greece. I've heard nothing but good things about Dogtooth, but I have not actually watched that yet. But I like his sort of off-kilter, sort of historical, but also sort of sci-fi, as you were mentioning, that the kinds of kindness is maybe moving away from that, but that sort of surreal nature of his movies, and the sort of the high concepts that are within them. I don't know. I really like them. And I thought this movie worked really well. We will get into some of the complaints that some people had. And it's just, I think a lot of them are valid. It just didn't matter to me. I was like, this movie worked. I was happy the whole time through. I was cackling a whole bunch. And I really liked being in this world and watching this journey. How about you, Jen? What did you think?
I really enjoyed The Lobster. There were a couple moments where I was like, this might be too weird for me. Or too what's the word? It's not even just dark, but too casually violent in some ways. The Lobster has a couple moments where you're just like, oh wow, that's a thing that's happening. Whereas The Favorite actually, I think, is much more my speed, partly because it hits those sort of period notes, like you were saying. I think it's probably the most accessible of all of his films, or at least that's what I've heard from people who've seen all of them. But it does kind of riff off of period films in a way that I really enjoyed. So, but in general, just the dark, wicked humor of his films, I've always really liked, and even sometimes it goes too far. And I feel like Poor Things was no exception for me. It was I was laughing constantly, and the writing to me was so smart. This is a movie that has a lot. We're going to get into it later, but a movie that has a lot of ideas, and is sort of layering different ideas on top of each other in a way that I found to be really interesting. But yeah, so I feel like the movie has a lot of ideas, and it's more so than even The Favorite and the Lobster. I feel like it is very fantastical in a way that I would not associate with those other two films. And that really just gets me where I live. Like the fact that this involved Victorian dissection and like scientists, and like is just of a certain period that I typically really enjoy, and is hitting all of those sort of like weird gothic notes too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really made it work for me. I feel like my main critique the first time I saw this was that there's about 20 minutes in it, sort of in the middle, kind of towards the end,
Early act
that I
three,
did
probably, right?
yeah, like yeah, that sounds right. I don't want to get more specific with that because that would spoil it
Sure.
potentially. But that didn't need to be as long. When I rewatched it this time around, and granted I did it in multiple sittings, which probably played a factor, but because I knew where it was going, the pacing in general just felt a lot slower. Um, and I didn't mind that necessarily, but I definitely did notice it. So I kind of understood more people who sort of were like, this movie's too long and too slow. I kind of started to understand that more the second time around. I still enjoyed it
Mm-hmm.
tremendously, but sort of was like, oh, I can kind of see why like this movie might need another edit, and that'd
That's
be perfect.
because I actually like, I there was we will have to wait to get into the spoiler territory to discuss, but I do remember thinking like, sure, this movie's like 2 hours and 20 minutes. It probably would be better if it were 2 hours, not necessarily to cut 20 minutes out of a section, but to cut 20 minutes, sort of shave it off
Across, yeah.
across the whole time. But then watching it, I did watch. We watched it in one sitting. That it actually felt more like the parts where I was like, this is probably where you could trim something. I was like, but I don't want to lose any of this. So I do think there's a little bit of, maybe it's asking for an investment, and you have to sort of want to do each of the steps along the way, which I understand if there's people that some of the parts don't work as well or are not as engaging to them. But I felt it actually all came together a little bit better, which wasn't thinking of it in terms of pace. I didn't feel like I lost anything pace wise, maybe because I was looking at it from what could be taken out
Mm-hmm.
to tighten the whole thing up, and I didn't see anything that I was like, we could definitely lose this, without feeling like that's something that
No,
we
you're
would.
right. Every little bit contributes something to the overall
Mhm.
idea of the movie, and so yeah, I definitely hear that. We did get remotely Antonio and Greg's. I asked both of them if they wanted us to share any takes that they had about the film. Antonio said that he thought that his sort of opinion of it was most similar to mine. He said stunning craft and performances, but a middling and repetitive section toward the end that doesn't seem worth any substantive gain. So yeah, I think he's that does sound very similar to what I just said. And then Greg said, and this is not actually a take about the movie necessarily, but he said the only take I demand you consider is that Lily should have won Best Actress. So yeah, we will get to that sort of when we talk about Emma Stone and her performance later on.
And as much as I love Emma Stone in this movie, I am more than okay with supporting that take and endorsing it.
Same. We
But
were all there.
but again, like Emma Stone's really great in this, so it's tough.
I think we're ready for the recommendation algorithm in which we establish the audience of a film. So the segment we like to kind of approach is like not every film is for everyone. And so whose algorithm is this hitting, right? Like like who wants to go see this movie? Who we think should go see this movie? For me, the kind of big question is sort of like I still don't really know, because I think originally critics were like, this movie's going to be way too weird for the Academy. And then it ended up winning 4 Oscars, right? So clearly people liked it. So how does that translate in terms of how we recommend this movie to our listeners, do you think?
I mean, I think something to think about is we get so wrapped up in what's going to happen at the Academy Awards, what's going to happen at the Oscars, and is this too far or too much? But that the Oscars like things that are weirder than a lot of people do. Like I'm thinking about this is I think a decade ago or almost a decade ago when Birdman won, and I knew a bunch of people. Jen would refer to them as normies who saw it, who rented it, and were just like, "What the hell's happening in this movie? This movie's terrible. Like it's so weird. Like I don't care. I don't understand what's going on." The sort of craft components to it didn't matter to them at all. It's like it feels like one long take, and they're like, what does that mean? Like I don't care. It's just people complaining about being actors. Like this is dumb. So I think that the fact, I guess all that is to say, the fact that it was successful, Poor Things was successful at the Oscars, does not negate the fact that it may be too weird for a lot of people. And I would say that I guess to start approaching the question from sort of, well, who should not watch this? I would say anyone who is sort of prudish about sex scenes in movies would not enjoy this, because there are many sex scenes in this movie. The sort of exploration of the main character's burgeoning sexuality and her explorations around that is a key component. And when it's not being demonstrated on screen, it is frequently being discussed and talked about, I think, to many humorous ends in terms of what happens during and what is said during the course of the movie. But yeah, if someone's like, I don't really want to watch that, or if you're in a context where it's like, well, my kids are around, or I'm with my older relatives, then that may not be that's something to be aware of, and that may be a bad match for this. But I mean, I think Victorian Gothic fantasy, sci-fi, Frankenstein derived and clearly inspired area, but like minus most of the horror, and instead sort of leaning into social commentary and comedy, is, if that sounds like something where it's like, ooh, like that's intriguing, I like that. Or if you just like, I like watching movies with crazy sets, I like watching a movie with impeccable design and costumes, then this could be right up your alley if the other parts of it are not going to turn you off.
So is it like if you like Young Frankenstein, but more graphic?
Maybe. Here I'll say this. I do have a little notes of things I pulled from IMDb trivia, full acknowledgement of the boring sourcing for this, but it's from the September 2023 issue of Empire magazine. Yorgos Lanthimos, the director, gave the screenwriter Tony McNamara, who adopted this story from a book by Alistair Gray, and I think made a significant number of changes to how the story was initially. It's certainly where it's located, because it's, I think, almost all in Scotland in the book, if I recall correctly. Anyway, Lanthimos, the director, gave the screenwriter 3 films as a reference point for the look and feel of the movie he wanted to make from the book. It was Federico Fellini's The Ship Sails On, Louis Buñuel's Belle de Jour, and Young Frankenstein. So those are the 3 movies.
All right.
Like, this is the triangulation point. So, again, that sort of, young woman sexuality and kind of pushing the bounds of Belle de Jour, that sort of, kind of magical. I don't know if Fellini is magical realism, but, some like magical, just sort of like weirdness in the world. And then that sort of take on, the sort of comedic take on Frankenstein. So, if you're interested, if you like any of those movies, if you want, Young Frankenstein, but with a more woman-based story, what if Terry Garr were the creation instead of just the like girlfriend, assistant?
Nice. I would also say that if you like fancy words and like wordplay and kind of like language, you know what I mean? Like if that's your cup of tea, I think this movie has a lot to offer in that way. Bella Baxter in some ways is like a human thesaurus.
I have, I did note on the second watch that segment of the movie where she's really leaning into like how she's learning words and putting out there. She sounds frequently like Johnny Five from Short Circuit, where it's just like rattling off a bunch of synonyms whenever trying to say something, which I don't made it more enjoyable for me.
That's great.
I would not recommend watching this movie because you enjoy the movie Short Circuit.
That's true.
That's not necessarily, that's just a random reference point. But I do think that, yeah, if you're interested in sort of depictions of cognitive development and you know, how the brain evolves and grows, that's another reason to potentially be into this. I think there's philosophical concepts that I don't want to talk about until we get into the spoiler section. But I will hint that like there are, you know, very explicit discussions of philosophical thought and characters who stand in for different schools of philosophical thought and sort of how they bounce off each other and interact. That's a part of it. And I cannot speak from experience, but I can speak from other people who do have this experience that because the movie opens with the beginning of the movie is that Emma Stone's character is in a sort of quickly advancing development, but in an early stage of development, that people who have toddlers or have been around toddlers as parents or as siblings really enjoy her performance, because it's like, yep, like that's someone who looked at their toddler and other toddlers and captured it in a grown-up person's body. And you can speak to that better than I can, Jen. But
yes, I also felt that a lot of the physical humor in the early parts of the movie, I was like, this is hitting too close to home. But what I thought was really interesting is I didn't know that Emma Stone had a 3-year-old, and so until she thanked said 3-year-old in her acceptance speech at the Oscars, and I was just like, oh, that makes so much sense. She's basically just drawing from her own experience with her own toddler. It just, everything. I was like, God, I get it. Like, that's how she was able to do this, because she's living it. But yeah, so all right, it seems good. And yeah, I would say that like if you find things that are twisted and weird and kind of offbeat and very blunt, if that tone usually appeals to you, then I would say you're going to be way into this movie. So, we're already tempted to share spoilers, so we are going to go into spoiler mode. If you have not seen Poor Things and you do not want it spoiled, please go see the film. It's really easy to go see it now. It's on Hulu. And potentially, if you have Disney Plus, Hulu's also on there now. I'm kind of confused by this, but it's easily accessible.
I don't know if they've crossed over movies with this amount of nudity onto Disney Plus yet.
That does seem weird.
But theoretically, that will happen at some point. I also feel like, this is maybe LA experience bias. It's back in a bunch of the theaters nearby because it was so successful. I think maybe in the lead up to the Oscars, and then now it's being held over because that and Oppenheimer are running again. It's so beautiful. Like, this movie is so.
It really looks great.
It looks really good, and the sound, the music, and the world that's created. It is great to watch it if you have a good theater with a good audience that will be paying attention to it and not just like making noises on their phone or whatever. There was a lot of there was some study that came out that said some high percentage of people are going to wait. You don't want to go to the theaters anymore. It's like 40% of people say they wait for streaming now. And the replies, there was lamenting of the death of the movie theater. And a lot of the replies were the movie theater experience is bad, blah, blah, blah. So if you've got, I don't want to get into all that anymore, but if it's a good theater and you have the opportunity, it's worth seeing on the big screen, but it's also really easy to just watch it at home.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I also saw that news and I was like, oh, we're going to be talking about this for a while. It's starting it all over again. The death of the movie theater discourse. But anyway, we are going into spoiler mode. So I want to start by invoking one of Greg's complaints about this movie. And that is, he complained that there was way too much fisheye lens used. And so for those of you who don't know, and I guess very much so if you haven't actually seen this movie, but there's a lot of like where the sides of the screen are sort of caving in on themselves I don't know if that's an accurate way to describe it, where things are stretched and distorted
Mm-hmm.
because it's supposed to kind of be this like eyeball view, kind of like, I guess, what is the fisheye lens supposed to do, like traditionally?
Well, I mean, it is supposed to look like what people, I mean, this is very obvious from the name, but it's supposed to sort of have this idea of this is what a fish would see. And a fish's eye is designed to see more than the sort of peripheral vision that humans have. It goes like further around. And so it gives it gives more of the space in one shot,
Right.
which there was, because this was, and I feel bad even because now that Greg's not able to be here, I feel bad being like, well, I spent all this time looking into this because he's so mad about the fisheye lens. I don't even think
He's
that
not
he
even
was
here.
mad. I feel like it was just the easy explanatory touch point for him feeling like the movie got a little repetitive and kind of kept going back to a similar well thematically and formalistically, I guess,
Yeah.
or aesthetically.
There are also a lot of keyhole shots where it's like you
Mhm.
feel like you're looking through like a little
Yes,
pinhole,
which
and like it's a little
sometimes
circle.
which sometimes is also, it feels like that's also the fisheye lens, but it's
Okay.
just they've
But
blacked
it's like
out the area
contracted or
around it.
something.
Yeah, it almost
Okay.
looks like one of those pinhole wipes where they sort of close something out like
Okay.
at the end of.
So anyway, my question about this, because this is just one of sort of many bold visual choices that I think Yorgos Lanthimos makes. Like the film goes from black and white to color, as many Oscar contenders did this year. That actually seemed to be like a weird trend in a lot of them
Yep.
using both black and white and color. But and also just like the design is really singular in terms of like it looks like nothing you've ever seen before. And so I generally wanted to kind of ask you, like, what do you feel like that added to the film, or like what do you think the potential purpose behind those choices might have been?
Well, I have a very long answer and I have a short answer. So I'll
Okay.
go with the short answer first. There are a bunch of articles because this was so obvious. It's something that is carrying forward from The Favorite. It also Yorgos Lanthimos's previous feature length movie. He also, after The Favorite, did a short film called Nimic that also had used this lens, and it's he and his cinematographer Robbie Ryan, I guess sort of worked on figuring out the lenses, and they spend a lot of time, or at least they talked about with Poor Things. They spend a lot of time narrowing down like what lenses they want to use in the camera, and then they only had 4 that they brought with them to film because they didn't
What?
want to have a ton of options. They wanted to figure out the look of
Oh,
everything
I
first.
see.
And then once they got to the set and we're filming it, it's like, okay, well, these are the choices we have. We only have these 4. And this was one of them. And that they went to it sort of for 2 reasons, a thematic one and a practical one. Again, I'll remind you, this is the short answer. The thematic one and the practical one. The thematic one is whenever sort of the like any character, because it does happen for multiple characters, but particularly Bella, sort of feels overwhelmed, whether that's positive or negative, with the world around her. So if there's a time when she feels sort of trapped, like when she's getting into the trunk for Mark Ruffalo's character, or when she's in the carriage with Willem Dafoe and Rami Youssef, and they're like, "No, you can't leave to get ice cream." Walking ice, I think is what she says.
Yes.
And so that's filmed there because it's like, well, she can't leave, and so she's trapped. Or if she's sort of experienced something new that is like she's sort of potentially overwhelmed by it. And then the practical one is they set up, like they built these sets, and especially the buildings, the Godwin's house, the house where Bella grows up, and the lab that's attached to that, the cruise ship, the apartment in Lisbon, the brothel in Paris. All of those are sets they built, and they like arranged all the equipment so they could look at like so much of it through the fisheye lens, or have the camera follow people around. So it was, sometimes they were like, oh, we're doing this scene in this room and we want people to see all of this stuff that we have and sort of get a full scope of this whole place, and that it isn't like a 3-wall kind of proscenium stage type set, but it's actually like a physical place that is really existing, even though this movie is so fantastical. There's so many weird elements to it that it's a tactile place. So that's what I saw they were saying was sort of the reasoning for this. So I think, but I think it's also just supposed to be kind of disorienting
Yeah.
and throwing people off.
That's sort of where I landed, where like I feel like so much of the movie is about Bella as a uniquely clean slate going into the world, right? Because she's, and then we can say the spoiler. She has an infant's brain implanted in a grown woman's body.
Yes.
Let's just sit with that for a second. It's super weird.
Totally normal.
Right, like you do.
One of those movies.
And I feel like so much of it is just her kind of being wide-eyed, for lack of a better word, and like just taking in everything as she encounters it, right? And so much of this movie is about perception and learning, and I feel like the fisheye lens sort of like kind of visually imitates that idea. Like, yeah, disorientation is probably the best descriptor, right? Like, is it simulates sort of what she might be experiencing, being like, oh my gosh, like the world is like so crazy, and like, what is this? So yeah, that's the main thing. Whether or not it uses that too frequently, as sort of Greg was saying, I don't know. I didn't mind it at all.
I think that it's one of those things where if you're not vibing with the movie and you're not on its wavelength, it's kind of like, here comes some more of this BS coming our way. And it's like I don't remember who it was I was having this conversation with in my life, but I was talking to someone a few weeks ago who was just like, oh, if there's like an action scene in a movie, or there's like a fight or a battle, or a car chase, like I just zone out. I have no idea. I don't know what's happening. Like I find it very boring. That's not narratively interesting to me. And so I think that feeling of I'm not connecting to this, if you're not into the movie and you're not into, or you're feeling a little bit of distance to it, I think it's really easy when you start seeing a pattern of really anything. But when it starts feeling like this is just the same thing over and over, it just adds to that disconnect. It adds to you feeling pushed away from it. So again, sorry to speak for someone else who doesn't. Again, I think he gave this movie 4 stars on Letterboxd. It's not like Greg did not like this movie.
Yeah,
he just didn't like it as much as you and I did.
So is the point at which it transfers from black and white to color, that moment is significant, right? Because it's when is it when Bella goes to Lisbon?
It's when she first has sex. It cuts to her having sex.
I'm dumb.
With,
oh my gosh, yes, you're right.
With Duncan, and that's when it goes to color.
Right. Okay.
Although it's also, I noticed it the second time, it's also in color when we're seeing the scenes of her suicide, which we see glimpses of before we get to the actual switchover.
Right. Those are kind of cutting out of Bella's timeline.
Yes.
Right. That's just showing us what happened, not necessarily her remembering or anything.
And there, there's something to, this was something else that I read, and I don't think I took a note on where I saw this, that there's it goes from black and white to color, but there's still like a heavy saturation, and like the ways in which colors are presented get a little like more and more realistic as the story goes on, and that's mirroring her sort of maturing and getting more of a handle on herself and the world around her. So by the final sequence, when she returns to London for the last bit of the movie, it's, there's still a fisheye lens here or there, but it's, in terms of the colors and cinematography, it's very realistically depicted. So I think that, the fact that it is sort of still this desaturated view of Victoria, I think is the name of Bella before Bella, the original woman.
Yeah, Victoria Blessington, I think is her name.
The names in this are incredible.
They really are.
full marks all around. But yes, Victoria Blessington, that like she is not fully realized in the way that Bella eventually is, because it has a sort of washed out color that you get in like Lisbon and on the boat, on the cruise ship. So it's interesting the way in which that stuff gets used, and it is interesting to compare it to. Which we don't have to dig into too much, but the other movies, like you said, that were in the Oscar conversation this year that had that black and white to color, or going between black and white and color, and that some of them had very clear like thematic or timeline
or like
based
rules
reasons
about
for it.
like when
Right.
we're doing this, we're in black and white. When we're doing this, we're in, like
This
Oppenheimer was
means
like that.
something as opposed
Yeah.
to this looks cool, so we're just going to do it to look cool.
Right.
That was
Yeah.
There was one last Maestro shot before the Oscar season closes off.
Bah. Okay. No, we're not talking about Maestro, but I just gonna note that I disagree with that.
too, because there is it's chronological. It's sort of like the time moving forward. It reflects sort of
it's the history
film
of
and TV.
filmmaking alongside the history of Leonard Bernstein. Anyway, we're not talking about Maestro. That's not what this episode's for. We've already have a whole other episode. Greg and I talked about Maestro the entire time. The other really cool like visual or aesthetic quality of this film is that it's, like we've referred to a couple of times, it's not quite period. It's that period fantasy mix, right? Because it's definitely heavily drawing from Victorian looks and like settings, right? But it is also pretty futuristic or fantastical, right? Because like Bella has puffy sleeves, but she also has short shorts, right? Like it's not quite she doesn't have a hoop skirt the entire time, right? So it's not accurate to the Victorian period, but it's definitely inspired by it. And so what do you think, again, similar thing of like, what do you think that why is the film using that aesthetic, drawing from that aesthetic? Like, why is it set in this weird in between, not quite period, not quite fantasy?
Yeah, that Lisbon
world
outfit of the sort of the top of a Victorian dress and then like 1991 basketball shorts, like NBA yellow NBA,
and then like
shorts,
70s go-go boot or 60s go-go boots,
and that weird sort of like the sunglasses that have like the frames on the side in addition to the frames in the front. Incredible. I will also note, to avoid answering your question, I will also note that the gondolas presented in Lisbon make me feel slightly better about the pet project that may happen near here to build a gondola to Dodger Stadium. Paid for by the guy that owns the parking lot that is somehow going to make money off of this.
What?
But instead of making like another train line or a dedicated bus line up, he wants to build a gondola that will go from Union Station to Dodger Stadium. So if that does happen, I can just think that I'm in Poor Things when I drive down Broadway towards downtown from where I live. Anyway, I think that part of it is that the story can only exist as it exists with some degree of a sci-fi element to it. Like if the theory of the character is this is someone with a rapidly advancing infant brain in a fully matured adult body, then that's fantastical. And putting that in a Victorian era, so it has that Gothic component, and very clearly derived from Frankenstein and having Frankenstein elements to it, between the lab and the strange Godwin's weird digestion machine that he has to
gastric juices.
His gastric juices. It turns out we need him. That thing like feels a lot like those sort of those greebles and switches that are in the lab in the James Whale Frankenstein. So instead of making it, putting it in the present day and having it be sort of fantastical with advanced science, it has this Gothic horror. Some may argue, and some may stringently argue against, that it's steampunk type elements and settings. But I think that in a way it helps with bringing the viewer along with the sense of strangeness of the world. That is what Bella is experiencing as she's relearning the world around her. But I think it also like feels less strange than if this was like set today. And it was like, oh, someone in a lab in downtown New York like did this thing, and now this person's wandering around Prospect Park, and like it would just feel a little bit like this is not something that happens. And so I think that putting it in this weird fantastical world and aesthetic.
You mean like in Barbie? Like
kind of, I guess, but like
kidding.
But then because Barbie Land is such a strong like component, I guess, and that's something we didn't talk about in the short take, but there are people who sort of really put those two movies in conversation, of like a woman from a strange in a strange situation who realizes herself and potentially the arc of her character is very basic feminism philosophy, which is one of the critiques of both of those movies, is that the philosophy that comes through is not particularly deep if you are very learned in the theory around that. But yeah, I think that like it helps keep it weirder, while also, because it's everything is so weird, it's easier to buy in to the central weirdness of what's happening to this character. What do you think? What do you think about it?
So to me, and to give super quick context that just sort of explains why I think this. My dissertation was about late Victorian popular fiction, sort of tangentially referencing Frankenstein, but everything else that I talked about in my dissertation was in the 1890s or around that era. And so I didn't really get to talk about Frankenstein because it was too far apart historically. But the whole point of my dissertation was sort of tracking the mad scientist figure and how pinpointing its origins in like Victorian popular fiction. And so I bring that up to sort of say that I've read a lot of Victorian literature in my life, and the choice to draw from the Victorian period specifically and not just any old-timey period, right? Because they could have easily done what you're sort of saying, mixing the 17th century, like everyone could be wearing powdered wigs, but have short shorts, and like that would sort of accomplish a similar thing, right? In terms of the fantasy elements and whatever. But I feel like, to me, the idea of female hysteria in Victorian literature and like women, like the whole idea, and this especially becomes very explicit at the very end when we meet Alfie Blessington, her Victoria Blessington's husband, right? That the idea was like women having agency and having, in particular, sexual desire was considered madness, right? And like that's how it was dealt with. It was like, oh, like if you're bucking social norms in any way as a woman, Victorian woman, like to the madhouse you go, right? There are entire novels, like suspenseful novels, based on this premise, and so like to me, it seems so purposeful that because so much of this movie is about social norms and sort of how arbitrary social norms are, and especially for women, how it's like everything in society is constantly trying to control you, right? I feel like that is just a reference that is so much richer because it's actually drawing from the actual historical period in which that was the most one of the period one of the periods where it was the most prevalent or obvious or part of cultural discourse, right? So that's sort of why I feel like it works, but also like it just looks cool is the other thing. When I was watching it this time, to go back to the steampunk question, which again, Mike and Oscar originated this amazing bit where every time they talked about Poor Things, one of them just said, "But is it steampunk?" And it was just really funny all season. I loved it. This rewatch, I feel like it technically might not be steampunk because I didn't actually see anything that's steam powered.
Well, the only thing I saw that seemed steam powered, I had thought the gondolas were, but there's no. They look electrical.
It looks like electric cables, kind of.
When Bella is like, I want to go outside, and they go in the carriage to the river, and they are around in the park for a little while, or whatever the country wooded area. Their carriage has a steam contraption on the back of it, and I don't know if that is powering the carriage or if that's maybe powering something.
That's enough.
The carriage, but that's the only real like steamy component beyond that green smoke coming out of the ship, which is, it feels like it could just be a regular ship, but because it's green, it feels like, well, there's some that feels punky. I don't know. There's punkiness to it.
Green smoke.
Or a regular steamer.
It's the punk and steampunk. Yeah, but I think I'm just being nitpicky because it's funny, but yes, so it technically skates in, I guess, into the steampunk genre. But I mean, in general, it's following the spirit of steampunk, because like the whole point of steampunk is that you're smashing together futuristic technology with like an old timey Victorian aesthetic, right? Like that's why people have corsets and goggles and like, I don't know. And they're like hot air balloons and like, so I feel like even if it isn't exactly traditional steampunk, I think it is sort of like in the spirit of it, if not technically a part of it. So this might be a good segue into just overall, like, what do we feel like the themes of this movie are, and what do we feel like the film at the end of the day is trying to say? Because I feel like, to me at least, there's definitely the development of Bella Baxter, right? That's most if not all of the movie is concerned with that. But there's all this other stuff about society and women and politics and philosophy. So, like, I don't know, what do you make of it all, PC?
Well, I think this is the time when I have to dip into my long talk about stuff. Which, first of all, I want to say I love that glimpse into the Victorian literature. I'm glad we got to hear your expertise in that, because that's an element I hadn't thought about. I was not aware, or if I were aware, I had forgotten the facts about all of that. So I think that makes sense. What I got into, and again, I apologize, Greg, assuming that you're listening, that all of this was sort of to like come at you, bro, about your being like, I don't know, fisheye lens, blah, blah, blah. So I started there, but it led into this sort of multi-layers of theory about narrative and art and dramatic presentation. So in looking around at sort of like, well, what was that like? Why did they make these choices of the film? Which I think we'll come back to talking about the themes, I think, of what the movie's trying to say. Is when Yorgos Lanthimos and Robbie Ryan were talking about the look of the movie, they said Lanthimos said one of the people he really wanted to be inspired, the look to be inspired by, was Rainier Werner Fassbinder, who's a German director from the 70s. We'll just sort of hang on him, a complicated man, and put that there. But I think the movie of his that's on the Sight and Sound Top 100 list is Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, I think. But I made like a ton of movies in a pretty short amount of time, and had this sort of post new wave like German film movement. He was sort of like one of the people out there really talking about it, and his approach, sort of looking into his approach, that he really was into this concept called the distancing effect, which comes from Bertolt Brecht, and then going back from Brecht to Victor Shklovsky, excuse me, who is a Russian formalist, and sort of his theory of defamiliarization or estrangement. It kind of depends on how people want to translate it, but this is where it probably gets too long. But I've got sort of an extensive quote that I think is important for
Do it.
what Poor Things was doing and what it was getting into. So a 1917 essay he wrote. So again, we're talking 106 years ago, 106 years before Poor Things, 107 now. It's called Art as Device. And he says, Shklovsky, I think I'm saying that right, Shklovsky. Considering the laws of perception, we see that routine actions become automatic. All our skills retreat into the unconscious / automatic domain. You will agree with this if you remember the feeling you had when holding a quill in your hand for the first time, or speaking a foreign language for the first time, and compare it to the feeling you have when doing it for the 10,000th time. It is the automatization process which explains the laws of our prosaic speech, its understructured phrases, and its half-pronounced words. This process is ideally expressed in algebra, which replaces things with symbols. Algebraizing, automatizing a thing, we save the greatest amount of perceptual effort. Things are either given as a single feature, for instance, a number, or else they follow a formula of sorts without ever reaching consciousness. This is how life becomes nothing and disappears. Automatization eats things: clothes, furniture, your wife, the fear of war. And so this thing we call art exists in order to restore the sensation of life, in order to make us feel things, in order to make a stone stony. The goal of art is to create the sensation of seeing and not merely recognizing things. The device of art is the estrangement of things and the complication of the form, which increases the duration and the complexity of perception, as the process of perception is, in art, an end in itself and must be prolonged. So there's some ellipses in there to sort of condense that down. But But yeah, so that's the sort of idea of like shake yourself out of the quick like ways of seeing things. And so I think that a lot of the sort of perception, like the way that things are framed here, the fact that it is this conflict between Victorian sort of very kind of buttoned up Victorian society, but it's also this fantastical steampunk science fiction-y elements plus some of the visual things that are there are important. So that sort of this concept, this estrangement or defamiliarization was sort of carried forward, was an influence on Brecht and his epic theater movement. And again, not as long, but another quote here from the Actor Hub website, which is talking about it from the perspective of actors and how they can learn about this and take it and use it in performances. But their summary of it, with again some ellipses, is epic theater proposed that a play should not cause the spectator to identify emotionally with the characters or action before him or her, but should instead provoke rational self-reflection and a critical view of the action on the stage. They must not sit back and feel, but sit forward and think. To do this, Brecht designed various theatrical techniques that the audience would always be reminded that the play is a representation of reality and not reality itself. One of Brecht's most important principles was what he called the Verfremdungseffekt, which is roughly translated as defamiliarization effect or the estrangement effect. To achieve this, Brecht wrote, stripping the event of its self-evident, familiar, obvious quality and creating a sense of astonishment and curiosity about them. All these elements discourage the audience from identifying with characters and so losing detachment if you're too much identifying with them. So the action must continually be made strange, alien, remote, separate. To do this, the director must use any device that preserves or establishes this distancing. Film directors generally thought of as incorporating and carrying forward these techniques include Godard, Hal Hartley, Lars von Trier, and Rainier Werner Fassbinder, who was like the direct influence here onto Poor Things. So I think that it's like all of that is to say that I think what the movie wants people to do is try to relook at the way the world is set up and be like, why is this the way that it is? And what are the things that we just assume is fine? That Bella, who is, again, like, can present as an adult person and go out and interact with the world and be interacted with the assumption that like, oh, this is like an adult, but is still sort of formulating new ideas and approaching everything anew, will be like, that's crazy. Like, why would we do that? Like, this baby's bothering me. Why wouldn't I punch it? I don't like eating this thing. Why wouldn't I spit it out? Why can't I just, I was horny. So I made out with this guy. Like, why would I not do that when I can still come back and have sex with you? Like all these sort of societal norms and principles. Why would we think that? Why would we keep those? And the influence or the sort of infusion of different political philosophies or just philosophical schools of thought throughout the movie. There's explicitly cynicism, there's Marxism and socialism, and there's obviously like a patriarchal approach to sort of the society that exists, are all sort of presented as things that are around that we should question and push back on and use maybe, but not necessarily just sort of accept because they must be true. And so instead, it's trying to sort of jostle us out of what we take as normal and making it feel not normal, so we can wonder like, well, why are we doing that, or why is that the way that it is? The end.
I really love that. And I feel like before you said, and Bella Baxter is the representation of this, because like that, while you were saying the original quote, that's exactly what I was thinking. I'm like, oh, this is what she's doing. We're like, she is creating the defamiliarization for us and is sort of like actively living it and acting it out. Right. And I think that works so well because, Emma Stone has described Bella Baxter as being someone without shame and without self-judgment. Mm-hmm. But it's also this thing you're talking about, because that almost implies that inherently when we learn about social norms, we are also learning shame and self-judgment, right? Like, because so many social norms go directly against sort of like, and you can argue whether or not this is true, but like against what I think this movie is sort of proposing as quote unquote our nature, right? like things, our natural impulses, right? Like they're being filtered through society. I think the code word that the movie uses very frequently is polite society. Like anytime
Yes.
they mention polite society, it's doing the thing you're doing of being like, oh, like Bella has no idea that this is a thing that you're supposed to do or think, right? And in and her reaction to it is always pointing out how absurd and arbitrary that thing is, which is what I really love. Where it's like, well, what? I think one of the best ones is where it's after she and Duncan have sex in Lisbon,
Furious
and
jumping.
she's yes, I guess that we could use. That's so good. Yeah, they just finished Furious jumping, and she's like, "All right, I'm ready to go again." And then he has to explain to her, "Well, like that's not really how it works. Like, even I have my limits." And then she takes it to the logical conclusion of like, "Well, this is a weakness in men, is it not?" And he's like, like, right? So like she because she is applying logic to things, and that is butting up against social norms and kind of polite society's values, right? That's where that tension is the best, I think, is because like when her like because she is so logical and empirical, right, that she's constantly pointing out how illogical a lot of society is. Which is it's a great joy constantly in this movie, which I feel like, if to think back to my question earlier about why does this have to be Victorian, why does this have to be based, like inspired by Frankenstein, sort of, right? Like, why does it have those roots? That's also part of it, is like this idea of the scientific mind and the scientific method. I feel like is how she is able to, because she says something like bringing something to its logical conclusion. I feel like she says that to Duncan at one point, and like, because that is what's really pushing her even further to sort of like challenge these social norms, right?
Yeah, at one point. Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, and not just saying delighted after everything, right?
Delighted. How unusual.
How is the pastry so crisp?
Why? How is this pastry so crisp? Also on the list of potential things I was going to say to open the episode. If Greg were here, I might have gone with that to keep it even shorter. But yes, I mean, I love all of that. I agree with all that. I think there's one part on the ship where Duncan says something like, how do you like not know the word for, I forget what it is, like cinnamon or something. How do you not know the word cinnamon, but you know the empirical method? Like, why, like, how is that possible? And
it's like, you've never heard of chess.
Right.
It's two things he says. I can't remember what it is. Yeah. It's like, you've never heard of chess, but you know the word empirical.
Right. And I think, it ties in well with what you were saying about that sort of the place of women in Victorian society and also in Victorian literature. It reinforces the idea of this is the right time to have this is the right era to tell the story of a character that is pushing back on all of this and trying to defamiliarize everyone, because it was, even more so than other periods, or at least it came across so acutely that like there's a severe punishment for not doing what you're supposed to do and not not following the rules of polite society. So it almost it makes it seem even riskier and also more abnormal to be like, oh yeah, someone in those sleeves would not talk this way or do this thing, because that's just not, that doesn't make any sense based on all the stories we've heard. You
And
get
what's
locked
great
in
too
the
is
attic
that,
long before this.
right, exactly. Like, oh, poor Bertha. Justice for Bertha. Bertha Mason. So the funniest thing too is that Duncan actually uses polite society to describe himself, where he says like, I don't care about polite society. He says that a bunch at the very beginning of the movie. And then you quickly learn that he's just all talk. Like, he's the one who's constantly policing Bella to be like, don't say that. Like, don't do that. Right. Like,
well, I think, yeah. And it's interesting. That was one of the responses to hopefully she's okay with it, bring in one of Jasmine's views. This is one of her favorite movies of last year. But after we watched it the first time, she was like, I don't know if Mark Ruffalo was actually good in it. Like, she thought he was like turned up like too far.
Right, too
like,
much.
He was too much. But watching it again, like, because we had talked about that, we both separately, and then afterwards, like, we're like, yeah, we both did sort of see that, how he's not like that through the whole movie. The memories you have of him in the movie are as the character is unraveling and getting crazier and crazier, and swearing more and being more denigrating and just more angry and like flipping out about everything, just getting this overly emotional. But he's so controlled and sure of himself in the beginning, and feels like such a in a different way than Willem Dafoe's Godwin does, but he feels like such a representation of the patriarchal society of the Victorian era, because he's like, oh no, like, I'm not part of that. I'm not part of society. Like, I'm a cad. I go against the grain, but like in a very acceptable way of like, yes, a man goes around and sleeps with lots of women and goes off on adventures. Like, of course, that's always welcome in a patriarchal society. And then he starts crashing against the cliffs of Bella Baxter and her empirical approach and her way of questioning things and what she wants, and her actually saying the things that people aren't supposed to say. And he just unravels and absolutely loses it. And I think that's wonderful. I think it's a wonderful performance. And I think that degradation is a lot clearer the second time through than the first time, where, I mean, he's definitely, has this like foppish air about him. A friend and former guest on the show, Jim Clements, will not forgive him for his British accent in this movie. He says it's so terrible. But I think that whether intentional or not, maybe that's just how Mark Ruffalo does a British accent, and that's unacceptable to British people. But I think that's part of this sort of fake veneer of him as being like, he thinks he's someone and he's not. Like, he actually is, he, if not someone already broken, he is very easily broken by Bella in the course of this movie, and it makes her angry and displeased, as I believe she says.
Seeing
to
the
him
tables turn with the two of them is so fun, because like at the very beginning he's like, now I warn you, don't fall in love with me, right? Because I have nothing to offer you in terms of constancy. And then it turns out that he's the one, like, and then cut to later in the movie where he's just standing in the snow being like, Bella.
Yeah.
So good. But yeah. Okay. So you had a really good question in here that I think is sort of a natural like a natural follow-up to what we've just been talking about. But you said who is or are the monsters in this film? And I think, again, that question, the fact that you're asking that question, speaks to why it's so important that this story be told through the lens of like a Frankenstein story, because it's like based on just purely on the plot premise, right? Bella would be the monster, right? Godwin created her. She's this like freakish reanimated baby's brain in an adult body, right? Like, so like, seems like she would, I'm going to say that as many times until it starts to make more sense, I guess. But I guess like, but then that opens up, just having that be the baseline narrative or plot premise, like opens up so much in terms of, well, who's like morally, right, or socially, who are the monsters? So yeah, what did you have in mind when you asked this question?
Well, there's two characters, I believe, or two entities, maybe concepts, who are referred to as a monster in the movie. And the first is Godwin himself, when early in the movie, when he first meets, I feel bad, it's Max McCandless, Rami Youssef's character. He's giving a lecture. The other students, one of whom is Will, the towel boy from Ted Lasso, which I realized this time and was slightly disconcerting. But they're just like, who can pay attention to him? Like, who can pay attention when this monster is speaking? Because his face is all scarred, and they don't even know like how messed up he actually is. And then the other, again, person, maybe I'll put that in quotes, is towards the very end of the movie, when Bella is back with Alfie Blessington, who sees her as his wife. Victoria says, oh, like, you didn't want, she's like, well, why would I have tried to kill myself? And she's like, well, he's like, you really didn't want to have this baby. You refer to it as the monster. And so, because in a way it's like, well, then that's also Bella, because that's the brain she has, and she like grows and emerges into it. So that's like another person referring to her as the monster, but it's also not her, because like she's a new person. Like, she isn't Victoria or Victoria's baby. She's a new entity that sort of
Mhm.
emerged, nature versus nurture, in the conversation. But I couldn't recall an actual quote, and I couldn't find one. But all the stories about Godwin's dad certainly sounded monstrous. Of just
Oof,
like
yeah.
he does random experiments and he cut him up and caged his thumbs and all these crazy things that he did. That's certainly Max's reaction to that. It's always sort of like, good God, like there's always this revulsion that feels like, oh, it's monstrous. Duncan kidnaps her and then threatens to murder her and threatens to murder the old woman that she befriends. So like he's kind of a monster. Martha, yes.
Put respect on Martha's name.
Yes, sorry. And then Harry Astley, Jared Carmichael's character, sort of says like all of society is monstrous because of the social divisions and sort of the way things are set up there. Alfie is clearly a monster. Like he's just an asshole. So like he treats everyone very poorly. I just feel it feels like sort of society as it exists is full of monsters and like allows monsters to flourish, and the divides of things, it's all allowed to happen. And then after spending the whole movie being like, of course Bella's not the monster because Bella is our friend, or Bella is our character. But then at the end of the movie, she's basically taken over Godwin's role. Like she's still doing the experiments and she's living in his house and she's like letting other people do things for her and sort of ordering, very sort of nicely, but still like ordering people around and kind of arranging things to her benefit. So she does sort of like, even though she has all of these steps and she has all this opportunity to grow, she does still kind of end up being the monster at the end. Like even though Alfie's terrible, and it's very funny that he gets a goat brain put in his body and he's just babaing and eating grass. Like that's pretty bad. Like that's a bad thing. Like it almost would have been better to just let him die than to put him in this
It
position.
is funny. She was like, I won't let him bleed to death, but turning him into a goat.
A-okay.
Totally okay.
Yeah. Totally chill. I don't know. What did you think about the monster component?
So just to talk about the ending in particular, I feel like, I mean, now that you point all those things out, I agree with you. And now I'm questioning my own moral compass. But to me, that last scene where they're all sitting around drinking gin cocktails and reading books, I was like, we did it. Like
it's not bad. It's a pretty good life.
It just feels so triumphant, like that she went through all of this and defied polite society and came out okay, like that she survived all the attempts to control her and trap her and and kill her in some cases,
right?
and I feel like just the fact that she's able to live her life the way she wants to, right? She's sitting there with the book. She's going to become a surgeon because that's what she wants to do. They're cheering each other. She does get the housemaid in on the cocktails. So
that's
like
true.
Least,
yeah, the housemaid. It is Margaret Qualley's like Bella too. What's her name? Felicity is like, go get water for it. But like that doesn't. I did see a reaction.
It's water for the goat guy.
Right. I did see
Alfie.
a reaction online that was like, oh, and now she's just ordering the young version of her around
that
like
makes
a
sense.
servant. But it is, yeah, it's, she does seem like she's nicer, especially Godwin's like, I must no longer have emotional attachment. So he's just a jerk to Felicity whenever they're interacting. So I do think that it's for science, it's for the experiment. I do think that it is triumphant, and I do think it's a better world that she's created to the extent that the house where the Baxters live is an enclosed space that not everyone can leave. I think that is a better world than it is in the beginning of the movie because of Bella and because of the advancements that she made, and her friend from France is there, and Max is there, presumably either as her husband or another lover. The maid is treated as an equal. So no, there are good elements there, but it's not monstrousness free.
But you're also right to point out that it's sort of like the passing on of this generational trauma that originates with Godwin's dad, right? Like, because I feel like Godwin, in some ways, is a very sweet and caring character, right? He's her father, basically. and seems to really care about her, even though he would say that was like a weakness, or like that was interfering with his experiment, right?
Right.
But at the same time, he's doing all the things that his father did to him to Bella in a certain extent, in terms of treating her as an experimental subject, right? He's not mutilating her and torturing her in the same way, but in terms of trying to control the conditions in which she lives, right, for the sake of a scientific goal or like scientific discovery. And this actually was the thing that I talked about a ton in my dissertation, sort of the thread I tried to pull between different books that I talked about, is that the mad scientist comes from prioritizing the pursuit of scientific knowledge over rational behavior and morality, right? Of
Okay.
like, I just need to push the boundaries and break reality so badly that I'm willing to like eschew all sort of social values, right? Of like, I don't care, like I'm going to alienate myself to my family, right? I'm just going to be so focused on this thing. And even if and this goes back to the Mary Shelley's original Frankenstein, it's like, you're not thinking about the consequences of the discovery itself, right? You're just focused so much on can you do it, right? Can you achieve this scientific discovery? And so I feel like we see that passed on to Bella, right? Because she like, so you're not wrong, like because Godwin keeps talking about all the terrible things his father did to him, but then he has adopted the philosophy of the scientific method, right? And it's like, well, yeah, it's totally okay to like to take a dead body from the river and experiment on it and
cut out a baby.
Right. And then keep it in your house like it's your pet, right? And not let it leave, right? Or let her leave, I should say. But that's from I'm ascribing that to his point of view,
Yes.
right? And yet he still develops like a father-daughter relationship with her. And so, it seems like that she is sort of, if we're thinking about nature versus nurture, right? That's the nurture part, is that she is taking after Godwin because Godwin was her father functionally. But then there's also the line that Godwin has at the very end, right before he dies, where he says like, Felicity walks around banging a hammer to a song. There's no way I created that. Right. So there's a certain randomness of creation that he sort of attributes or says is beyond his control. Right. That so it's like the sort of the nature versus nurture, fate versus, well, not even fate, but there's like free will versus like how subject are you to society and a product of the social structures or social systems that you participate in, but how much is just like sort of unique to I don't know, like random chance and like and who you are, right, as like a unique individual and that sort of thing. So I don't know really where I was going with that.
Well, and there's also only so much control. Like obviously, there's the control portion of a good scientific experiment, but you can't control for what's going to be in someone's. If you're doing an experiment of I'm going to create someone, I'm going to create life and see how it develops, you can't mold it just a certain way because that's just not how. That's just not how it works.
Life takes on a life of its own after a certain point.
Now, Jen, would you say that Victorian era mad scientists are the original disruptors who just want to break it? Just want to break it, and then
I don't want the line to end with Elon Musk like this.
Well, I mean, look, when you were saying like they push experiments beyond societal standards, I did think about brain chips in chimpanzees and allegedly humans. So there's things that are happening where maybe it hasn't fully gone away. Some of these pushes.
No, for sure.
Quick Victorian literature trivia. Do you know Mary Shelley's maiden name?
I don't.
It's Godwin.
What?
Which is presumably why the character is named Godwin.
I should have known that.
Although it also leads to all those interesting. We spent so much time talking about the science of it. It's interesting all the ways in which because the character is then called God, of like what.
Right. That's hilarious.
What that leads to, and especially when Bella keeps referring to God, my father, is just like leads to another sort of philosophical perspective on things and how she could interpret that sort of marriage of science and religion in the presentation of that character.
Right. Which is very much a part of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is like that in doing this scientific experiment with Frankenstein's monster, he is defying God and therefore being punished, right? So there's definitely strains of that, like you said, in this movie. What's super interesting, though, is that when comparing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to this, like, one, the role of the monster is very different, right? Because Bella, it's sort of flipping the narrative, right? Because what happens, it's been a while since I've read it, but like, what happens in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is that Frankenstein's monster becomes so monstrous that that he's doomed, right? Like, and that's the punishment of Dr. Frankenstein, is like, how dare you defy God with your scientific experiment, and like, this is what befalls you, right? Like, all this disaster and violence, and I feel like the Frankenstein's monster has no chance in society at all, right? Like, they're doomed. Like, every time the monster tries to do something or interact with a person, right, they get totally rejected, or like it backfires in some way. You know what I mean? Like, like, just like doom and gloom is everywhere in terms of the monster's narrative. Whereas if, Bella is the new Frankenstein's monster in Poor Things, right? Like, she has the opposite journey where she breaks free, right? Like, she's charting her course to freedom, right? As Edie Carn says. Right?
Yes. And not just
So,
running off into the Arctic like Frankenstein's monster in the book.
right. She's not exiled
freedom.
from society. She stands her ground in it. In a way, again, that's why I view that final scene as so triumphant, right? Because she didn't cave at no point did she learn to modify her behavior. She kept questioning the social norms. She kept defamiliarizing it, right? So, so in that sense, it's actually a very optimistic and hopeful movie, weirdly.
Yeah, well, which is interesting when we go, it's hard without having this whole conversation. Anyone still listening who hasn't watched it, it's part of the recommendation algorithm is like, it is kind of this like triumph overall of like, people thinking independently and trying to sort of actually, reassess or have a clear-eyed assessment of society and the world around them, and then try to reconfigure it, at least their life and their immediate surroundings, to make it a little bit better. And at least, if they're going to do something like put a goat brain into someone's body, it's a wicked person who deserves it, who has
Right.
has given ample evidence that they deserve such treatment, and not just sort of a random, a random person.
But it is weird that like none of the scientists are punished in the same way that Dr. Frankenstein is.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
Although, yeah, it's also interesting because Godwin is the one who looks like Frankenstein's monster, even though he takes the role of Dr. Frankenstein because he has the scars and everything, almost to the point of it feels like his father, Bella's grandfather, as it were, feels like Dr. Frankenstein, and then he's the monster, and then Bella is like next generation, creation, which
the Frankenstein cinematic universe. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, it did exist in the 30s, but she's not the bride of Frankenstein because he thinks of her as a father, because he's not. He's a eunuch and needs a lot of electricity, which he does make it seem like that's the only reason he didn't create her to then take her as a wife, is because he's like, I can't do anything with her. Which is another glimpse into, he's maybe not the most, pure of mind in the way he's approaching these things.
Where do we go from here? I think, because we're already we've been barreling towards Rhetorical Situation this entire time.
I mean, I think we've just been bouncing. We've like 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Yeah. So now I don't know what to do. Like, do we just go full on in there and finish this up, or do we? Because I feel like we should also talk about some of the criticisms of the film.
Yeah, let's do that, and then we'll go back to the Rhetorical Situation, right? I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, or are the criticisms in the Rhetorical Situation now?
No, they're not.
Okay.
I don't think.
Yeah. Well, let's do the criticisms, because I did just talk about the sexualization of Bella in the eyes of the person who was repeatedly referred to as her father, and that one of the critiques of them, one of the sort of, I don't want to say deeper critiques, but I guess more fundamental critiques than some of the ones that maybe, we share in our long take review, or we have within our long take review community, is about this core idea of a character that is hypersexualized and hypersexually active in the movie is someone who is, as Jen has said multiple times, an adult person with a toddler brain put inside of it. And folks read that as, oh, this is a story about people having sex with a toddler. And that, like, you know, the fact that so much enjoyment in the first part of the movie is, oh, Emma Stone knows how to, you know, emulate the behavior of like a small child and moves around that way. That then when it pivots to she's an object of desire for other people, because she still is Emma Stone and looks like Emma Stone, that it's like, oh, you know, the other men will look at her that way, that there's something sort of, you know, pedophilia adjacent to this, and that the movie is endorsing that, which I think is sort of the very, like, no, someone who didn't see the movie like thinks that, where they just see the log line and it's just like, oh, well, this movie is terrible. But yeah, you know, it certainly does complicate things. What did you think about this
Well,
blowback?
I think my initial reaction to that criticism was like, oh no. And like made me sort of try to I was like, oh, do I need to rethink my entire reaction to this movie? But then I sort of was like, well, but that sort of, I don't agree with that the film is therefore endorsing it part. It could very well be baked into the story, right? But I feel like in general, the movie is definitely saying all men are complicit in objectifying women and sort of commodifying them, right? In a way, even the quote unquote good guys, right? Even Max, right, is his name.
Mm-hmm.
Even Max and Godwin, who are, you know, relative to other characters in the movie, care more about Bella, right? They love her more genuinely, right? They even still are trying to control her, right? And sort of like, and abuse her in a way that is really gross. So, and whether or not she's a child at the time, I feel like, I don't know if that necessarily changes that, right? I think they're indicted either way in terms of like, because especially in those early scenes, like Max is definitely like, he's supposed to be kind of her, I mean, he's not supposed to be her caretaker, but he ends up kind of being her caretaker, right? And she's like, just like when she's passed out on the bed and her like dress is open, right? Like he's not the good guy in that moment, right? Like he's like definitely looking at her like with a sense of desire and like, right.
He's noting it.
Right. And so like, so he's thinking, and when he talks to Godwin about like, well, I wasn't sure if you were created her to be your mistress, right? Like, forgive the dark thought, right? He's had those dark thoughts too, right? So I feel like, and okay, and the other thing too is like Duncan becomes less and less attracted to her over the course of the film. Part of that is because she's rejecting him and sort of like becoming her own autonomous person, free thinking person. But he also specifically, and this is on the cruise ship, he specifically says, you're reading all the time. Like that's a bad thing, right? And then he says, and you've lost your adorable way of speaking. Which to me indicates that Duncan actually was kind of being a pedophile in a certain way, or was like something about her youth and innocence and sort of her being like childlike was part of his attraction, like was part of the attraction to her for him, right? Which I think it's kind of there, but I feel like the movie is indicting it and not therefore endorsing it.
Right. Yeah, that it's not necessarily a celebration, or, you know, it's not a celebration of that aspect of it. Yeah, and I think that, you know, I think there's a degree to which there are people that want to be, I don't want to be like, oh, people just want to be mad about stuff. But I think that specifically people want to say that art and movies and Hollywood are, you know, a morally degrading force in society, and they sexualize children and they do terrible things, and, you know, everyone's a groomer and blah blah blah. And so that, like, this got kind of swept up in that, to a degree. You know, and I think, you know, that's sort of coming from, I would say, like a bad faith place. But I think there are people who are like, don't subscribe to that theory, but we're like, I don't know, like I found this uncomfortable. And I think that's that's one of those things where it's like, it's similar to the more I don't want to say normal complaints, but the I guess more common complaints that could happen to any movie of like, these segments go on too long, or I don't like the pacing of the thing that I remember thinking the first time through, of like, it felt like the story was ending and then it's like, but now her husband's here, Victoria's husband's back, and we're gonna do like 15 minutes of her, which is like, I think you need in the movie. And I remember being like, yes, this is good, but also being like, why is this now? Like, it kind of felt like we were done. And I think that's whatever. I think that's, push some people when they're like, this movie's a little too long. It could be wrapped up a little bit quicker. All those I think are fair complaints, as is, I think, if this made you uncomfortable, it made you uncomfortable. And that's, I understand that. I did find, and again, this is just real basic IMDb trivia research. I'm not special on this regard. But one of the quotes, because it was talking about that there is this like, complaint here, and it said, speaking to the Times about the backlash. I don't know which Times it was. I'm assuming the New York Times, but who knows? It could be the London Times. It could be the LA Times. Emma Stone said, if it helps, as the person who played it and produced it, I didn't see her as a child in any of those scenes. Director Lanthimos added, but even that's too literal. If you take a film that literally, where you start discussing it in terms of the brain of a child, then you're kind of missing the point of storytelling in general. If you start to analyze the film as something that would actually happen, then of course the film doesn't work. Because it's just like, because it's just so fantastical, is just like, yeah, if you start getting into the morality of like, but like, of course you could put a brain of one person into another person and have that brain be functioning that body, but like, where did that brain come from, and what do we think about the body of that brain, whatever, that it's like, it doesn't make sense. Like, none of this would actually make sense. It's all sort of symbolic of someone seeing the world anew, and that it isn't that she's actually a child, is she's an adult who is like catching up with the world around her.
Right. You could also pretty easily argue that she's not actually, the brain does not remain an infant for very long in the movie, because they've established that her growth and development is accelerated, right? And that, it's really just up until Godwin tries to marry her off to Max. To me, that feels like sort of where the infant stage ends, and then her adolescence sort of begins, right?
Right.
Or like her, young adulthood.
Yeah, it's soon after that she realizes, like, I could masturbate and it would feel great, and then starts trying to tell everyone about it. And they're like, that's the first sort of, in polite society, we don't do that.
Right.
She grabbed my hairy business, I believe the maid says.
So many funny lines in this movie.
Really
but yeah, and I feel like, so I feel like I don't want to minimize like you're saying, if people did feel uncomfortable because of that watching the movie, right? Obviously we don't want to invalidate those feelings, right, in that response. But I do feel like, as an intellectual critique, it doesn't really hold up. But
yeah, and again, if you're an hour and a half into a podcast episode for a movie you haven't seen, and you're like, I still don't know if I should see it, if the log line you've heard from this movie is a toddler in a human body, it has a lot of sex, then like, that's not really what this movie is. Like, this isn't like, people who go back and watch the movie Big and are like, so really, this adult woman was sleeping with a 13-year-old? Like, that's weird. Like, that's weird that was a celebrated thing. It isn't really that story. It's more fantastical than that. And there's more, like, the character as presented is a independent individual person that is not the former woman or the former baby.
Right.
It's this new amalgam.
So we've referenced several times the pacing and the editing and the length being the other sort of major critique, which I feel like in my mind is a lot more reasonable, because it's partially the reaction that I had to it. And now I can be more specific because we're in spoiler mode. To me, it mostly was the time she spends in Paris working in the brothel. That to me was the only stretch where I was like, I understand the nuances of each situation she's in, and partly the repetition of like, oh, and here's another
Right.
a male customer, right? Here's another situation. Here's another situation. Is showing only by doing that over and over again can you show that she really has like learned a lot from this experience, like she says.
Mm-hmm. And the
But at the
passage of
same,
time.
right, exactly, and you can make that argument for like why the whole movie has the pacing that it does, right? It's like
Right.
it's trying to track her development. You can only do that kind of incrementally, and gradually over time. But I feel like that stretch in particular, like I understood what the point of it was pretty quickly in terms of like its role in the movie. But then I was like, I don't know if I needed all. I could have done this in a montage.
I mean, I guess it feels like a montage a little bit. Like, I mean, it's not like hyper fast montage, but like every time it's just sort of like, and here's her with another client. It kind of just feels like in the background there's just calendar pages being ripped off the wall of like, oh, okay, yeah, she's here a little bit longer.
I guess I wanted the training montage version of this. You know what I mean? Because
Yeah,
that's
you wanted
essentially what it is.
the Rocky
Yeah.
version. I mean, I also feel like the evolution of her interactions with Swiney, the madam played by Catherine Hunter, as well as Toinette, Susie Bemba's like fellow sex worker that's in there, to me seemed worth it. Like, and I think the perspective of Swiney as another potential sort of monstrous figure who has a very sort of practical, and Bella does sort of connect with it of like, this is a way to make money. We have to do the things that we're doing in order to keep the business running, to like support this baby. Like, look at this child. And that, like, you know, here's some like rules of the world, but that also will like get so attracted to her, she tries to bite her ear off or like gnaws on her leg. So there's just the, you know, there's this kind of like feral component to that I, you know, seems important. And then she gets closer to her friend who she's learning sort of some of the politics from. And that sort of opens the door of like, but like you have a cesarean scar, like you had a baby, like that's what that scar is. That's not from something else. Like that's, so like, what's the story? Like, and, you know, I think that all of those to me, as someone who will defend, I guess, the pacing of it is that also did feel like a part of like, oh, maybe this could be tighter. But like, I think if you rushed the development of those two threads into just like a quick montage with like jokey cuts to the different customers, it might sort of just get overwhelming and feel like it's the movie being like, anyway, you got to know this, and this, like, this is what's happening now. And so I would think there's probably little beats that could be pulled out, that could shave the time down. Maybe Duncan only needs to come back like once, either out the window or, you know, running into her on the street. Although I love that he's like, you had sex with the guy with hooks, didn't you? Like, I've already beat him up. Like, that part's great. You know, it's, I get it. It is, and at that point in the movie, it's just sort of like, well, we're still going. Like, this is still happening. And you know, you've learned that Godwin is sick and is dying, and so like you kind of know, like, oh, this is going to end with her having to go back to see him, and to see Max. But yeah, I mean, again, I get it. I don't, you know, it's no disrespect to anyone who was like, yeah, this needed to be cut down a little bit. But I think that you would lose a lot if you took any parts of that out.
Sure.
And maybe losing that is worth it to have a tighter pace and to get to the next step, you know, more quickly. But yeah, going into the second watch, I was thinking like, there's got to be 15 minutes that you can just like cut out.
Yeah.
Even if it's, you know, 7 or 8 moments of, you know, a minute or two each. But it didn't, to me, didn't stand out, as there's like times for that.
And to go back to your point earlier about the part with Alfie feeling like, oh, this is like a whole other thing. I also feel like that's pretty purposeful, because I think we get the sort of marriage resolution dangled in front of us.
Right.
Right. And then it's like, nope. What? You know what kind of movie you're watching, right? Like,
Right.
We're not going to give that to you. Right. So I did kind of like that, because I did have that reaction where I was like, oh, this feels like the movie's wrapping up. And I'm like, like I should have known better. Because then it's like, oh, of course, like why would this movie of all movies end with a marriage, right? And that is, again, a very classical sort of narrative resolution for Victorian literature a lot of the time, right? Is like that everyone, especially sort of early Victorian, not late as much, but like your Jane Austen stories, right? That everything is, all conflict is resolved by a marriage at the end. So like I like that it was sort of subverting that.
Yeah, which would subjugate the woman and sort of, after all of that, Bella being like, I will choose to be a wife instead of a person, in the context of a Victorian narrative. So, you're right. It makes a ton of sense. And I think, I remember in the theater when that woman comes up and is like, oh, like Victoria Blessington, and she's like, no, like, you have not seen her. I'm Bella Baxter. I was like, well, that's going to happen later. We're going to figure out who Victoria was. And then it like had just gotten to the point where I had forgotten about that when it was like he came
also
in.
I don't know if it needs to be said, but her name is literally Victoria. Like that's pretty.
Yeah, it's on the nose.
Pretty explicit.
Yeah, that's the version of her that died, and now she is something new, Bella, something beautiful and different than the Victoria.
All right, are we ready for Rhetorical Situation?
Yeah, I mean, let's return to it after we've been kind of sidestepping.
Like there's a lot that we've already covered that could have gone in here, but just to put a pin on it, right?
Let's do the drop.
This is the Rhetorical Situation, a segment in which we look at a film through the lens of our academic experience. And you're probably wondering, like, haven't you been doing that the whole time? But now we're doing it officially. So we do this segment because all 4 of our regular co-hosts are writing professors. So we like to have this section dedicated to making explicit connections to our experience as scholars and teachers. The rhetorical situation refers to any contextual factors that influence composing interpretation. So for me, the main contextual factor, and this is actually one that that hasn't come up in past rhetorical situations, is this idea of ideology. And we've already talked about a bunch of them. We've probably named many that I would probably put on this list. But like the thing I thought was so interesting about this movie is that it sort of like has so many ideologies woven in and out of it. And I wouldn't say that they're necessarily, like, I mean, sometimes they are conflicting, but it's not a binary of like, oh, it's this or this, right? And that's what's so interesting to me, is that there's a multitude to varying degrees of these different ideologies. We've already talked about the idea of rebelling against polite society, right? I think that's definitely part of it. But like, what do you think of in terms of like the role of that ideology plays in terms of how we interpret this film?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've been saying it as the philosophies, but I think ideologies is also another way of thinking about it. That there's a lot of different flavors of patriarchal ideology in the movie, from Godwin as the father being like, I will control this, my child, I will control the situation, we will stay locked up in the tower, and that will be contained, to Duncan, who plays at rejecting the sort of polite society ideology, but is maybe the actual biggest reinforcer of it, which again we have already talked about that. And then when she falls back into Alfie Blessington, the sort of, I'm the husband, I'm the lord of the manor, I treat everyone terribly. It gets the only hint of positive relationship that between Alfie and Victoria is that they enjoyed being terrible to the people,
to
under
other
them.
people.
And she says something of like, oh, like you seemed very cruel, and he's like, like old Victoria would never have been so boring as to like issue that sort of judgment. So I don't know if cruelty counts as an ideology. Maybe it does, but at least that flavor of patriarchy, of just like control and all of that. And then there's the explicit socialism of and I have to remember the character's name, Toinette, her friend from the brothel, who is just like, I'm a socialist, takes her to socialism meetings, and she's our bodies are our means of production, or we are our own means of production, something like that is what she says to Duncan.
I believe
to describe.
it's they say he calls them whores, and then he's like, and then they say, we are our own means of production. Go
That's
away.
it. Yes.
It's so good.
Incredible. So yeah, so there's that element. There's again the kind of religious component around God as a character and the creator of life, being someone there and his kind of rules, science as an ideology, feminism as an ideology that's coming through of her sort of pushing back on all of this. So I think there are a lot. Oh, and cynicism from Jared
Mm-hmm.
Carmichael's character Harry Astley, and it's sort of just like none of this matters. All society's bad. So yeah, I think there are a lot of ideologies, and part of that is that from the and I have to think of the term that I was so focused on, defamiliarization. There we go. And estrangement. Defamiliarizing. Bella's like, well, doesn't know these things, so she gets to sort of look at and
Mm-hmm.
kind of play with some of these of like, oh yeah, I don't like that. Like, well, this isn't a good idea. And so, a lot of the patriarchal stuff gets dismissed really quickly. She really engages with the cynicism, in terms of it. The attempts to show it to her is like, look at these poor people, and like, there's nothing you can do about it. And she's like, I'm going to try to do something about it, which probably doesn't end up helping anyone besides those two guys working the dock. But that's she's trying, and she really try. The socialism, it looks like she spends a lot of time with. So it's the fact that it's defamiliarized lets her sort of pick and choose what's an ideology that's actually worth exploring and maybe integrating into her life, as opposed to everyone in just sort of acting like this is normal and okay, and her immediately being like, no, like, what? This is terrible. But what were your ideological thoughts?
So I do think there is, especially in the is it Alexandria is where they see the slum at the hotel, right? And she kind of has this like crazy breakdown where she's like, because she's never seen such a thing before, or never thought about her own privilege and sort of how that makes her feel in relationship to seeing people who are so poor, right? There's definitely like an anti-capitalist approach, and I guess like you could say that's where the socialism comes from, right? Where it's like I think the conclusion that they draw is like, or this is what the Jared Carmichael, Harry is his name, right? That's what he explains it to her that like, well, if we went down there, they would very rightfully like attack us,
right? Take all of our stuff.
Yeah, and if you were in their place, so would you, and like, or that they would switch places with you and do the same thing to you, like, you know what I mean, like,
right.
And so he kind of establishes the system of like, because everyone's pursuing their own self-interest, this is how this happens, and it's just like the way the social disparity and the socioeconomic disparity, and this is just how it is, right?
And nothing that, like, can change because
right. So and I also really liked built into it sort of the critique of the philosophers, right? Because I think on the boat she's reading, I want to say Emerson, and she was like, he must not know any women or something. Like, yes. It's really funny where she's just like, I suppose he's just never met one, right? Like, and so she's kind of critiquing the philosophy as like not accounting for women in some way. So yeah, and what's really interesting is like, normally we really discourage our students from using dictionary definitions in their arguments, but I did happen to just look up. I'm like, what is actually the technical definition of ideology?
Webster's defines.
The archaic definition is the science of ideas, which I feel like ties in really nicely to what the film is trying to do, right? Because it's like she's the scientist and she's like absorbing all of these ideas and pitting them against each other, right? She arguably gets the most excited when she's hearing Martha and Harry argue. Like, she says some line to Duncan where she's like, they are like, philosophies are flying back and forth, and she's like so excited by this, right? So I really like the idea that she's like testing out all of these ideologies throughout the film, and so that there's, and that's why I didn't want to say that they were conflicting, because like a lot of times they may be like being argued and debated, but they are coexisting all in this world. In a way that's really interesting.
And none of them like wins in the end.
Right.
There's no sort of like, and here we are at the end.
We reached the answer, right?
Yes. We cracked the code. But that was a great little lesson for any students out there who are still listening almost 2 hours into the episode. If you really want to do the dictionary definition, don't do the Webster's defines. You got to do the archaic definition, go etymological. And then it suddenly feels like, oh, there's something here. What's the origin of this word? It doesn't just sort of feel like filler space. So good demonstration for our students who are, of course, all listening intently
right.
to what we're saying on,
Hanging
on
on
our
every word.
podcast.
But yeah, I just thought this was really interesting because, like, again, to bring it back to students, because that's sort of like, the part of the origins of the rhetorical situation is like, I oftentimes, if a student's writing an argumentative essay, I have to kind of poke and prod them to be like, but what is the underlying ideology of what you're talking about, right? Like, what is the sort of more accessible way to put it is like, what are the values that are underpinning the way that you're arguing about this, right? And that, if you don't have an awareness of that, it's much easier for someone to contradict what you're saying, right? Or
Right.
start poke holes in it. Like, you have to be in control and aware of the, like, both like the what the other arguments ideologies are and what yours is, and sort of like, and if you're okay with that, kind of, you know what I
Right.
mean? So yeah, I feel like this film really does a great job of demonstrating how important ideology is, right? Because every time Bella talks to somebody, they have a different, they ascribe to a different world order, kind of, you know what I mean? Like a different system. And then she has to kind of be like, well, like, here are the things that don't make sense about that. Right.
Yeah, and the fact that she's, willing to push back against it and inquire and sort of be like, I don't understand. Like, what does that mean? Or what about that? So what? In that way that a lot of people would just sort of hear someone say something and maybe be like, okay, like, that's fine, or I agree, or whatever, that isn't investigated. There isn't a lot of interrogation around it. So her doing that pushes people to have to reveal more about their society, which also creates, you in the context of the movie, this ability for a sort of Brechtian assemblage of characters who are like, I am here to talk about this perspective and this point of view, but not necessarily feel like, without taking away from the humor of the interactions or, some actual like emotional connections between people, or at least emotional investments in the exchanges, which I think sometimes traditional epic theater Brechtian approaches can feel very like removed from that. So yeah, I think you're still able to laugh every minute or two while all this stuff is bubbling around in the bottom of the movie, which I think is to its credit and is pretty impressive.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I also like that she kind of goes through what our students oftentimes do, of like the surface level conclusion, right? This is what happens in Alexandria. She's like, okay, there are poor people. I'm going to gather up this box of money and give it to these people to give to the poor people, right? And then that will fix the problem, right? But then what she discovers the hard way is that, no, in fact, that money, although she doesn't even realize it actually, so maybe it doesn't count.
That's
but
never
like,
actually clear to her.
Right. We see that, well, what she doesn't realize, what she's being naive about, and what she doesn't understand the complexity of the social system is that, the people she gave the money to aren't just going to give it to the poor people. They're going to take it for themselves, right? Or that if you give all your money to the poor people and you yourself are on the street, have you actually accomplished anything necessarily? Or like, is that, or like, how do you weigh those two?
Right. Or even
things?
If she gives away all the money, which again, on some level, it's also like, well, she's not giving away all the money she has because she still has Godwin's money sewn into
that's true. Yes.
her dress. So she knows that she's got a safety net. But, that like, even if what she did help all of those people, that's just one group of people in one slum in one city. And I think that in the conversation she had with Harry, it was made clear that there are more, those are not the only poor people that exist in the world, even though like she hasn't actually seen any of them or gotten evidence of them before in her life.
And so you're making me realize that if Harry is cynicism, she's idealism in that section of the film.
Yes.
Right.
Because he says like, I wanted to hurt you. Like I wanted to like, because I don't know if he actually calls her idealistic, but like if he doesn't, he all but says like, you are so kind of wide-eyed about all this. Like I wanted to crush that because like, I can't feel that. And she's like, oh, you're just hurt because you're just a little boy who's hurt because of by the world.
Right.
And he's like, that may be true. And that, like they say, all cynics, the deepest cynics are like truly romantics who wish they could believe in what they want to believe.
Yeah. To leave philosophy for a moment and just talk about Gerard Carmichael, like,
Please.
I in some ways I really liked him in this role, but in other ways his performance was so jarring. And I don't know if it's because he's supposed to be the American and that just his line delivery and his intonation just like doesn't match with everybody else. And again, that could very well be deliberate, in which case I appreciate the choice. But just purely as a viewer in the audience, I was just like, what movie are we in now? Like, I don't understand what is happening. But I do really like that the whole cruise ship section of the film does feel a lot like modernist expats. Like the Harry, I don't know if there's supposed to be a 1-to-1 correlation, but Harry felt a lot to me like a James Baldwin or something like that, where it's like, he's an American who's traveling around Europe and thinking and writing and stuff like that, and like and Martha to a certain extent feels like that too. She feels like the like female equivalent of the expat writer and thinker. But I did like how we kind of go from the 1890s to the 1920s, like, but without really passing any time at all.
It's also, hearkening back to sort of thinking about the color presentation of things, that it goes from black and white to this sort of
like sepia.
Kind of drained color a little bit. And it's the most fantastical coloring on the ship because, again, there's the green smoke. The sky sort of looks like it's perpetually sunset, and the waves seem to me very clearly to be CGI. Like, everything is, the artifice there isn't just the sets, but it's also, it's not the volume, I don't think, but they did say it was like essentially that LED.
So yeah, I was watching a behind the scenes thing earlier today. I think it was Vanity Fair. They called it like notes on a scene, and so it was like Yorgos, Mark Ruffalo, and Emma Stone gathered around like a tablet that was showing the movie, and they all had like pens so they could like circle. It was really fun. But the main thing that I learned from that is that when they were shooting these scenes, that anything that's in the background that looks totally not realistic was actually like an giant LED screen that they had. And it was like, so like when it was the ocean on the cruise ship, like when the actors are playing off each other, there's actually like an image of like crashing waves next to them.
That makes sense
for them to play off of. And Emma Stone was like, it was actually kind of nauseating. In certain plates, it was tough. But yeah, so I thought, and basically the only special effects that they would add, like Yorgos sort of marked it up, was like, well, you see, like the screen would go to like here, and then this like little tiny like triangle at the top of the screen where we'd have to fill in to make it look full.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's fun
because it was literally like a projector screen that they would just have on set.
That's great. That's that. I don't want to say like, well, you could tell, but it has that sort of unreal feeling to it, which I think made sense in the context of the fantastical story and in her journey of, like she gets one step, she gets one place, she gets to explore Lisbon and walk around on her own and see what's happening there and experience that. And now she's sort of out further into the world. She's getting exposed to different people from different, more people from more places, more perspectives, like cynicism, and also how the seeing the slums. And so I think that, the visual of where they all are, and to a degree, Jared Carmichael's flat American affectation also sort of feels like, because that is a different spin. That feels very Yorgos. Like it feels very like that feels like it wouldn't have been out of place in The Lobster, like the way he's talking and performing. Yeah. So that made sense, but it did feel like everyone else is this sort of heightened, not caricature, but again, people there were complaints from friends of ours about like some of the accents, and there are a lot of American actors playing British, English or Scottish characters in the story. And so, yeah, having like an American show up and be very, very American and also very sort of like droll and detached did feel like a radical shift, which, you know, I think has thrown some people out of the movie and are like, oh, he's actually doing a bad job. You know, maybe there is a degree of that's what Jared Carmichael does, and he isn't going to do much things that are different than that. But
it did give me flashbacks to when he hosted the Golden Globes.
Yes.
Is that what he did? Right?
Yeah.
Like that was the show it was, right?
The Rethaniel year where he had his big stand-up special and then got some hosting gigs.
Right. Where there was a point where you're like, do you even want to be here right now?
A chronic
He's just sitting on the stage being like, I don't know.
Yes. Apparently a chronic problem at award shows is hosts who don't want to be there and wish they were doing something else.
For sure. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. I love, and I would not have thought about this unless I had this conversation with you, but I love the idea of Bella as a scientist of not the human body, but of ideas. I think that's a really cool way to look at her character in the film.
And we don't need to do Oscars watch because we watched them already last week.
Yep.
But you know, just to note that, you know, the three below the line wins that it had, all excellent, all I think very well deserved. I'm glad it won all of those. Production design, costume design, and makeup and hairstyling. Incredible. All those, like, and it looks really good and is a way to sort of award this movie for a lot of this, that artifice component that I think is important and crucial to sort of what it is actually aiming to accomplish. As Greg said, we're all here on Team Lily. Like, we loved Lily Gladstone and wanted her to win, but like, if Emma Stone didn't already have an Oscar, I probably would have been going hard.
You've been rooting for her, probably.
I would have been like, sorry, Lily, but like Emma Stone's knocking it out of the park. I don't mind that she got a second Oscar for this, even though if I, you know, Oscar fairy magic wand would switch it over. But, you know, not undeserved because she did a great job. And also, you know, again, to draw another comparison to Barbie, similar to Margot Robbie, you know, Emma Stone had a strong hand producing this. You know, Yorgos Lanthimos did develop it and you know, wanted to adapt the story and worked with the screenwriter, as we sort of talked about earlier, but brought it to Emma Stone, I think, pretty early in the process. And she made sure to use sort of her star power to be like, yep, it is going to include all these sex scenes. Yep, it's going to look like this. That is what the story is going to be. We're going to make this happen. And, you know, good for her. Because they're
going to be burp bubbles.
Right. There's going to be a whole thing about burp bubbles that is not explained at first and then is explained later and is still crazy.
All right. Well, I think we're ready. This bubble's ready to burst. So I think we're ready to wrap up. I still think Lily Gladstone should have won, but I totally get it. And Emma Stone is astonishing in this movie. Just all the things she has to do and sustain for the entire time. So, and the postmortem does seem to be like that it was the screen time issue of like people thought Lily was not in Killers of the Flower Moon enough, and also that people like Poor Things a lot more than they liked Killers of the Flower Moon as a movie, and that played into it as well. So, yeah, really interesting.
Could we go back in time and give Lily Gladstone Best Actress for Certain Women instead of Emma Stone winning for La La Land? And then,
all right. So, PT, thank you so much. This was such like a deep and enriching conversation about this movie. It made me appreciate it even more, and hopefully that's true for our listeners as well. The brave souls that are still with us.
I will say it made me appreciate when there's a third person between the two of us, because I think that having another person mitigates both of our desires to just be like, let's just talk about this for an extra
forever.
10 minutes. And
true.
just, you know, again, similar to the Poor Things. Like, what do we cut out? We don't know, but we did somehow push to over 2 hours.
Yeah.
On this.
Just hopefully no one wants to turn us into goats after listening to this. That's all
crossed.
I ask. But PT, just remind everybody, where can they find and follow the show?
Well, you can, anyone out there who wants to hear more, you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast, wherever you're listening right now. You can subscribe somewhere on the screen of where you're listening. There's going to be a subscribe button. The podcast is based on Jen's Substack, thelongtake.substack.com. You will also get her wonderful written reviews if you subscribe there. So that's a good bonus. But, really anywhere you get your podcast, don't hesitate to give us a rating or leave a review. If that would helps us get more visibility, so that would be lovely. On social media, you can follow us on Instagram and Threads at The Long Take Review. You can follow us on Letterboxd, the profile LTR Pod, or you can search for the tag LTR Pod to see what we've been watching and what reviews we have and how many times Greg has chided Jen for forgetting to put the tag onto a review. And if you'd like to send us...
I can't believe he called me out in the comments on Letterboxd. I was like...
He did. It must be noted. And you can send us an email to thelongtakereview@gmail.com.
All right. And you can find me on Instagram and Threads at Sopchockchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI. And you can find me on Letterboxd at Qui-Gon Jen. And apologies for my froggy voice that probably has gotten froggier as we've talked for 2 hours. I'm sure that didn't help things at all. But thanks everybody for listening. Hopefully Explorer Blood's in you.
Why do you pen book every nut?
Thanks for listening. You can follow The Long Take Review on Substack at thelongtake.substack.com. Subscribe for free to receive new podcast episodes as well as written reviews of films with Oscar buzz and new films and series from pop franchises like Star Wars and Marvel.